Okay, today I'm joined by Shaun McCarthy, OBE, the Chair of Action Sustainability and the founder of the Supply Chain Sustainability School. Shaun was awarded the OBE for services to sustainability at the London 2012 Olympics. So, welcome, Shaun.
Thank you. Hi, Gareth. It's good to catch up with you again after all this time.
It's my pleasure. You've got a long and illustrious CV, but I'd like to start at the beginning. How and where, when, and why did you first begin in sustainability?
Oh, crikey, that does go back a long way. I'm a procurement person by background, and I had a very long career as a senior procurement professional. And to my shame, I worked in the oil and gas sector for quite a long time. But then I joined BAA, the airport company, in 1995. And that was around about the time that they were applying for consent to build Heathrow Terminal 5.
Mhm.
Um, so I came in procurement, and there's suddenly all these demands to, well, we need to do more business with smaller companies in the community, um, from our public affairs and planning people. And to be honest, it wasn't out of the goodness of their hearts. It was just, people feel a bit better about living next to a dirty, smelly airport if they're making some money out of it. And I was saying, well, no, that's not what I do. We're spending £1 million a day on capital without Terminal 5. And we need closer relationships with a smaller number of large suppliers. That's what procurement people do to leverage the benefit then of those relationships. Um, but they kept persisting. So I came back and said, well, what we can do is we can look at our tier one contractors and encourage them to engage in the lower tiers of the supply chain, with the local community, which is when I first engaged with a company called Business to Business. We ran the first Heathrow Meet the Buyer event. Neither of us can quite remember whether it was 1995 or 96. And the owner of that business was Ian Heptonstall, and Ian is my co-director and co-owner of Action Sustainability today. So we've actually been working together for very nearly 30 years now, longer than most marriages. Um, so we started the Heathrow Meet the Buyer event, and the idea was we'd get our tier one contractors in a room, we'd bring in local suppliers to meet them with a view to generating business. I didn't know that was called social and economic sustainability, or the S of ESG, or whatever at the time. It felt like the right thing to do, because clearly there were benefits in engaging local businesses, but not at tier one. So that's why we did it the way we did it. And as I say, cynically, the whole thing was predicated on the consent to build Terminal 5. Then we got quite involved with the local political community, with the leaders of the councils, also the local MP John McDonnell, who ended up shadow chancellor in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet, and they were saying, well, we've got another problem. We've got big ethnic minority communities in the area around Heathrow, and they're doing very nicely, thank you, but they're trading with each other. They're not really integrating their business interests. What can you do? Um, so we got the company's house book out, because that was before the days of the internet, and started to say, well, okay, do we what can we do about this? We'll look up all the foreign sounding names of business owners, and we'll target them, and then we'll start to record the amount of business that we're doing, not only with local businesses, but with ethnic minority owned businesses. Which, when I look back on it now, doing that in the mid '90s was actually quite revolutionary,
Yeah.
and different. So that got me started on the whole issue of how you engage value chains in order to deliver social outputs. Also, by default, I got the job of buying the electricity, and believe me, 7 airports in the UK use an awful lot of electricity, and we were doing it very badly. So I started doing it a bit better, and I saved the company an awful lot of money. At that time, we got a new chief executive, Mike Clasper, who was ex Procter and Gamble. Mike was very into the whole sustainability agenda. I got to meet him as one of his top 100 managers or whatever it was, explained what I'd done and, thought I'd get a pat on the head and told that I'm a good boy because I've saved loads of money. And he said, well, okay, so you're responsible for everything to do with utilities. Yeah. For the 7 airports. Yeah. Buying it, selling it to tenants on site, energy conservation, infrastructure. Yep. All of those things. Yeah. Okay. I'll tell you what I want you to do for me. I want you to do a carbon strategy. Okay, yes, sir, I can do a carbon strategy. This was in 1999, I think, or thereabouts. Again, when nobody was doing carbon strategies, so I got to pull together BA Airport's first carbon strategy. I think I was among the first in the UK to do this. There were kind of 3 of us, and we all knew each other. Boots and BT and BA, they all started with a B for some reason. We were all developing carbon strategies at the time. And again, came up with something that when I look back on it, it was quite radical. But it just seemed like the logical next step. And because I had I was reporting directly to the chief exec to do that, it gave me an awful lot of power and influence to really make a difference and do things. And then I started thinking more widely about, okay, so if we were to kind of translate this thinking to the whole of our supply chain, then how can we make a difference? How much difference can we make?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So it seems like that leadership coming from the chief executive really spurred a lot of change. I sometimes say leadership's the difference between the best at sustainability and the rest. That sounds like a good example of it.
Yeah, it's a very good example. Yeah.
So if we fast forward then to London 2012, which I mentioned in terms of your OBE, at the time it was heavily promoted as the Sustainable Olympics. With the benefit of almost 12 years of hindsight, how do you see it now?
Oh, that's a big question that probably needs quite a long answer. Yeah, I mean, just to explain, I was chair of something called the Commission for a Sustainable London 2012. And I started that role, in 2005 as a volunteer. I was part of the Mayor's Sustainable Development Commission, London Sustainable Development Commission, as it was known. And I got to chair the Olympic subgroup, which provided input into the sustainability aspects in the bid. And one line in the bid said, we're going to be the most sustainable games ever, and we will appoint an independent commission to provide assurance and oversight to that sustainability. So that was the gig that I got all the way through to 2013. Was it really sustainable? In the main, yes. There were some great successes and some really groundbreaking things that were done. But I always said at the time, there's no such thing as a sustainable Olympic Games. Mm-hmm. You can't have all these people traveling from all over the world and using all these resources to watch a few people run around for 6 weeks and then the party moves to another city. It just inherently is not sustainable. You can only call it sustainable, I believe, if you leave a legacy of sustainable good practice. So it was more than just doing some good stuff during the games. It was much more how much influence have you had more widely. And London 2012 did quite well. We had the new ISO standard for sustainable event management, ISO 20400, ironically, very much inspired by London 2012. An event sector supplement of GRI was developed in consultation with the London 2012 team. I think an awful lot has been done in the construction sector, where I do a lot of work these days, to raise the bar, because, probably for the first time ever, contracts were let with sustainability requirements in them, and the client actually followed up to make sure that they were really happening. And, contractors were required to report monthly on a whole range of social, economic, and environmental sustainability impacts. And it was my role as chair of the commission to make sure that all of that works the way it could, and to report in public whether it did or didn't work. And again, I suppose there's a kind of recurring theme of influence here. I got a lot done with a very small team of 3 people and 12 expert volunteer commissioners, because I had the right to report in public and because I reported directly to the political leadership. So that was kind of interesting as well, because it started off with Ken Livingstone and Tessa Jowell and ended up with Jeremy Hunt and Boris, which was quite an interesting experience in its own right. So, yes, I think some great things were achieved. We certainly moved the construction sector on. Food and catering, the London 2012 food vision, got people like McDonald's doing things that they would never have imagined doing at the time. Where we probably didn't do as well as we could was in the area of ethics and human rights, particularly in the deeper supply chains. Because what we found was you can't really. We had some NGOs put undercover workers into factories. One factory that made the cuddly toys, and a factory that made the pin badges. And although they'd been audited, they'd gone through the whole SEDEX process, and LOCOG, the organising committee, had reviewed all the audits. The undercover workers found breaches of all 10 principles of the Ethical Trade Initiative base code in both factories. By the time we came to investigate, one of the factories had closed. Sadly, the owner had passed away. The other factory for the cuddly toys, well, they stopped making cuddly toys for the Olympics, and they're making cuddly toys now for Disney.
Yeah.
Because you don't have that long-term relationship for an Olympic Games. You have it and then it's gone. Particularly the closer you get to the games for things like merchandise, which is bought very late on, you have a relationship with the supplier for about 6 months. So what I did after that was to actually work with John Morrison and his team at the Institute for Human Rights and Business to say, what we need is some form of permanent body that actually looks at the ethical and human rights aspects of sport. And out of that came the Centre for Human Rights and Sport, which still exists today. It's a well-funded, well-supported organisation, as a place where some of these issues, including some things that we didn't really touch on at all with the teams and the coaches and potential abuse of young people, etc. They're now doing a fantastic job. So even where we didn't do so well, we tried to leave a legacy that said, look, this is an issue that we've uncovered as a result of what we've done on the Olympics. Can somebody else take this on, please, and do something with it?
Yeah, well, legacy was something I was going to ask about, because once, I think it was in the late 90s, I visited the Barcelona Olympic sites, and it was like a complete ghost town.
Yeah.
And then, but I visited the London site, particularly the Velodrome, and they were shooting that reality TV show that they did about getting celebrities to cycle part of the Tour de France. They were filming that while we were there. Plus, there was the Velodrome was very busy, and it did seem to work through in terms of these things weren't just built for a single event. They do seem to have that legacy.
Yeah, there's been a great legacy locally, and again, it's kind of quite interesting if you look at the leadership at the time and the politics. Ken Livingstone would always say, this is a 1 in a 200 year opportunity to regenerate the East End, interrupted by 6 weeks of sport.
Yeah.
Lord Coe had a slightly different vision because he was all about sport, but that's what made the Olympic board so powerful. Yeah, it was an uphill struggle with legacy. There was a lot of roadblocks on the way. One was the media centre in Hackney, 1 million square feet. Which the world's media turn up. There has to be a whole load of tech in the into the building, and they're there for 6 weeks or so, and they go away again. Mm-hmm. So you're left with this big empty shed. What do we do with it? Various proposals came and went. At one point, it was going to be a distribution centre for Tesco. Another point, it was going to be one of these artificial snow ski slope things, none of which would have provided real quality. Well, the environmental impacts, obviously, of the artificial ski slope thing. that wouldn't have provided any real quality jobs for the young people in East London. And eventually BT Vision came in with their new TV offering to say, well, we want to headquarter our operation in that building. And BT had put all the tech in the first place anyway. And then Loughborough University came in and they set up a research centre for artificial intelligence, and various other kind of high-tech people came in. So that eventually was a success. It could have been a miserable failure. And then there was a whole debate over the stadium. The stadium was designed to be demountable.
Yeah.
So in the worst possible scenario, I suppose, you could take all the top sides down, and then you would end up with a 25,000 seat athletic stadium below ground. And that didn't happen, but there was a very strong bid from Tottenham Hotspur at the time, and their proposal was to tear the whole thing down and build a brand new stadium, which I very vocally opposed and said, no, this is a really bad idea. It's ended up with West Ham. Anybody who knows anything about London and knows anything about football will know that, locating Tottenham Hotspur in the East End really doesn't make very much sense because they're a North London club.
Yeah.
So, there were some really silly proposals on the table at the time. But I think, things like the Olympic Village, the athletes' accommodation, was always designed to be housing. And it was converted to athletes' accommodation for the period of the games and then converted back to housing afterwards. So, yeah, a lot of thought has gone in, and it's certainly made that part of London economically, socially, a very different place. It's brought a lot of inward investment, and it's certainly transformed that community, mostly for the better.
So when you talked about getting McDonald's to do things that they had done before. Do you think any of that lasted as a legacy within suppliers? I'm not specifically necessarily McDonald's, but the more general suppliers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's there's a lot more food standards now that are applied in the catering sector. Things like Red Tractor for meat and MSC for fish. And a lot more choices. And McDonald's were doing things for the games that they weren't doing normally. There were a lot more healthy options. They were doing all free range, organic, etc., etc. And now the world has changed, and you go to pretty much any hospitality place now, and there will be some information about sustainable options and healthy options, but they weren't at the time. So yes, I think in the catering sector, things have changed a lot, and there was a real emphasis on local and actually getting small local caterers providing food for the games, which in turn gave them a boost. And also you had a huge variety of different types of food because ethnically, East London is one of the most diverse places in the world. So there was actually food from all over the world because local suppliers were actually encouraged to get involved.
Excellent. So before we go on with because I think there's a nice thread on value chains and things to pick up on, but I can't miss out the opportunity to ask you, when the BBC decided to satirize the arrangements for 2012, the head of sustainability was a key character. What did you think about that?
Yeah, I wasn't the head of sustainability, just to be very clear. I had a very different role. The whole thing was hilarious. I think it was interesting because the BBC obviously were the broadcast partner for the games, so they were there for years before the game started, and a lot of the things that happened in that programme pretty much happened in real life.
Yeah,
they were really, really close. The sustainability lady was kind of portrayed as being a bit dippy, and I suppose that was the stereotype for sustainability people at the time. Thankfully, we moved on from that. But some of the things I don't. You may remember the episode where I think they had a delegation from Brazil that was supposed to be meeting Sebastian Coe, and the coach got lost. That actually happened to me. They called me up and said, there's a bunch of sort of very important people. There's the mayor of Rio and all sorts of people coming over from Brazil. Can you come and meet them? Yeah, okay. So I think I met them somewhere in Victoria Street, a government building of some sort, and they were travelling by coach, and they'd been at City Hall on the other side of the river. And of course, expected to get to Victoria Street in about 10 minutes, and it took about three-quarters of an hour. And literally, I'm saying, guys, I've got another meeting. I can't stay any longer. And I sort of waved hello to these people and then walked out of the building. And somebody must have been watching. And the one about the clock going backwards as well, that very nearly happened. So yeah, it was a little bit close to reality for those that were inside the program, but it was a very funny program. But yeah, if I look on it now and say, well, the portrayal of the sustainability manager as a kind of bit of a dippy female was not great, but things have moved on and it's fine.
I remember there being a constant debate about whether an issue was a sustainability debate or a
Yes,
legacy
or
debate.
legacy.
So,
That's right.
when we're having a conversation about the legacy of the buildings and the
Yeah.
legacy of what you did with the suppliers, that did spring to mind.
Yeah, there was no difference for me. I completely disagreed with that. But then it was a comedy program, and it was very successful and very funny.
You dine out on it, do
Yeah, yeah.
So, but picking up on that thread you were talking about, some of the issues, you obviously tried your best to go deep on the supply chain, and there were a couple of issues you flagged up there, which didn't get resolved in time. But was that the genesis of the supply chain sustainability school?
Very much so. What happened was, as I said earlier, for the first time, contractors were actually being asked to really deliver on quite stretching sustainability objectives. And, kind of me with my role as head of the commission at the top, that filtered all the way down through the ODA, the Olympic Delivery Authority, into the supply chain. What happened was Skanska came to my business, Action Sustainability, as consultants in around about 2010, 11, something like that. Just pretty much after the construction of the permanent Olympic venues was complete, ahead of time and on budget, I'd like to say. And they said, look, we've had this experience on the London Olympics, and we want to be the most sustainable construction company in the world. And what we've discovered as a result of the ODA program is our supply chain is not competent to deliver on our sustainability objectives. They had all sorts of problems trying to drag a sustainability performance out of their tier 2, 3, 4 supply chain. And they came to us and said, well, as consultants, come on then, Mr. Clever Supply Chain Sustainability Consultant, what can we do? And that's when we came up with the concept of the school. But what we said to Skanska is, really, this is too big for you. What you're trying to do is upskill an entire sector from a very low base in a skill that they know little or nothing about and are not particularly motivated to do it. So we went and phoned some of our mates to say, well, would you be willing to join a collaborative initiative? And if it was collaborative, then we could get some funding from CITB, Construction Industry Training Board, to make it happen. And 7 companies, well, Skanska plus 6 companies signed up. And that's when we started the school. We launched it in the summer of 2012, ironically, and it's grown from there. So, yes, the Olympics were very much a learning experience for all of the major construction contractors that were on the site. It was really the first time that they'd been held to account to deliver. Whereas previously, the sustainability stuff was all a bit, it was part of the tender evaluation, and you'd cut and paste all the nice words that you put in the last tender, and the supplier might put some conditions on it, but they probably won't check, so we'll carry on doing things the way we always have. What they found working with the ODA was that was not acceptable. They were really held to account for the first time. So yeah, there's definitely a link between those two things.
And how's the school developed? Is it still focused on construction skills? Because a previous person on the podcast has praised the school for upskilling on heat pumps, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, where we've gone to now, I mean, as I say, we started the school with 7 partners. I think we have something like 218 now. We we're in, where are we now? We're in February. Yeah, by the end of March, we will have trained 30,000 people in the built environment, the wider built environment sector. So obviously construction still plays a big part of what we do. But we started a facilities management school. We've started very recently a retrofit group. We're doing work on digital, on procurement, a lot of work around equalities and diversity. So we've expanded the school out to a range of topics that we call enablers for delivering a sustainable built environment. So, you need those management skills, interpersonal skills. You need to understand about the digital world. You need to understand off-site construction. If there are carbon and efficiency and sustainability benefits in building off-site, then you need to know how to do it, because actually the techniques are very different. So there's a lot of work has been done in that space. So yeah, the school has gone from being a little training initiative to being a very major influence in the world of sustainability in the built environment now, and covering a whole range of topics. We also have the ability with so many partners to be able to raise the bar on best practice and actually work together with partners. And examples of this in the very early days of the Modern Slavery Act, we got partners together to say, well, guys, what would you like to do? You've got this new legislation coming. You can either do what you usually do and go off and do your own thing and bring up some guidance for your suppliers. That's always a little bit different to your fellow contractors and confuse your supply chain. Or you could come together using the school as a safe place to develop one source of the truth. And that's what they did. And if you want to know about modern slavery now in the construction sector in the UK, you go to the school and you get the information you need. We've done quite a lot of work on plant and machinery and the air quality impacts of that. A lot of work on carbon, obviously, modern slavery, social value, etc., where we bring together interested groups of partners to say, okay, what can we do now to take the industry to the next level? So it's about leadership as well as being about learning.
Mm-hmm. And what's the biggest area of demand, would you say, just at the minute?
Carbon, and carbon. It's all about carbon, which I think is regrettable in many ways, because I think there tends to be a perception. Everybody wants to talk about, and they do specifically talk about CO2 and CO2 emissions from energy, where in fact that misses out a whole agenda around other greenhouse gases that we should be concerned about, things like refrigerants and various other methane and various other impacts there. So there is a big emphasis on carbon. It's what everybody wants to do. Everybody wants to know. We've got a very active climate action group. We've rolled out a free carbon calculator now that anybody can use to calculate your carbon footprint. And the tier ones and clients now are starting to push that, and they're starting to use that data that comes back out of that tool as part of their Scope 3 emissions. It's not the magic bullet for Scope 3, but it's part of the equation. So that's, the dominant topic. But then if we start to think about related topics like nature, biodiversity, has always been the poor relation. But I think people, again, driven by legislation around biodiversity net gain and those sorts of issues, that's starting to come to the fore. Social value is a big thing in government procurement, so it's of major interest to most of our clients as well. And human rights in a broader sense, labour standards. The construction industry is not well known for treating its workforce well. So labour standards in the industry, and then that segues quite nicely into well-being. We're doing quite a lot of work in that space as well, because the oft-quoted stat, which is really depressing, is that the male suicide rate in the construction sector is 3 times the national average. And there has to be a reason for that.
Yeah. Right.
So depressing note to end on. Sorry about that.
Well, no, was absolutely news to me. I wasn't sure that. Yeah,
Yeah.
quite a surprise. You're also run the ISO 20400.org website. So what's your connection with the standard? Well, maybe you
Right.
should
Okay.
introduce the standard first for our listeners.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, ISO 2400 is the global now standard for sustainable procurement practice. I think it's because being a procurement guy by background, I've kind of been involved one way or another in supply chains for pretty much all of my professional life now. Um, so I started thinking about sustainable procurement when I was at BA in the 90s, and I became part of the government sustainable procurement task force in 2005 when government first started to think about how can we leverage public procurement to deliver wider sustainability goals. And out of that, it was at that point actually I packed in having a proper job. I started the role in the Olympics and I started Action Sustainability at the same time, with a view to helping to actually spread the word about the findings from the task force. That led to a British standard, BS 8903, which is the world's first standard for sustainable procurement practice. And then we came to 2013 when there was a proposition to develop an ISO standard, ironically based on a French standard that came after the British standard. So I ended up leading the UK delegation in developing that standard, was fairly successful in getting it looking a lot more like the British standard than the French standard. It was a very similar structure, because we know that the way that we develop the British standard is based on something that works in practice. It's what we were doing every day as a business. So then there was a very long process to develop an ISO standard involving lots of very boring comments and tedious meetings, but in quite exotic parts of the world, but very tedious meetings. Finally, the standard was published in 2017. And in the last meeting of the committee, it was 40 odd different countries represented, usually around about 60 people in each of the meetings. We'd all got to know each other very well by then after 4 years. There was a proposal from the Australian delegation to say, well, we can't just leave it at this. We need to spread the word. We need to provide resources. We need website, we need tools, we need video, we need podcasts, we need all this stuff. And everybody went, yeah, and looked around and said, yeah, but nobody's got any money. And I said, well, Action Sustainability has a social enterprise arm. We fund that by funding 2.5% of the revenue of the trading business into the social business. And we've done lots of stuff. We've written books, we've sponsored academic work and all sorts of things. And I said, well, okay, we'll take this on. We'll host the website and we'll develop a global community of practice around sustainable procurement. So then ISO20400.org was born. And that continues to be a great success. It's the site's been accessed from practically all of the countries in the world. We have an international steering group now of primarily former members of the committee that developed the standard, but also people that we found around the world that have expertise and passion for sustainable procurement. So lots of really good multilingual content there. A nice little self-assessment tool that you can use. So ask yourself 20 questions about your sustainable procurement practice, and it will give you some idea of how well you are aligned to the standard. It's not perfect. It's just intended to give you a snapshot. That's available in something like 9 different languages. And we do podcasts and we do videos, and we collect best practice stories from people around the world, so they can load up their own stories. And it's a kind of knowledge sharing site, available in a whole multitude of different languages as well.
Yeah, the standards, unless it's changed in the last couple of years, the standard is quite a bit more complex than the typical ISO standard. If I remember right, it's got multiple continual improvement loops rather than the single one that ISO 14001, et cetera have?
Yes, it has. It's a very different sort of standard in that it's a guidance standard rather than a compliance standard. So you can't have a pass-fail audit, tick the box, put the certificate on the wall, and then carry on doing what you're doing before until the auditor turns up again. It's very much a journey, if you like. So you can align yourself against the standard, and you're absolutely right. There's a kind of a process to go through, not dissimilar to 14,001 in many ways. But because supply chains are so multifaceted, it's very difficult to sort of say, well, there's one way of doing it. So it's very much something that the user can adapt and adopt to their business requirements rather than a straightforward, you turn this handle, press this button, and out comes some sustainability. And if the auditor says it's good, then it's good. I'm always very cynical about audits, to be honest. I think audits are a competition between how good you are at hiding the bad stuff and how good the auditor is at finding it.
Yes.
And what I find in doing what we call evaluations against the ISO 20400 standard, we'll go into a client and say, well, just lay it all out there for us. Show us the bad stuff, because those are the bits that we really need to look at so we can provide some advice on how to deal with it. So people do ask me when it's going to grow up and be a proper standard, and I say, well, no, actually, I think it's a proper standard now, and I'd like other standards to grow up a bit more and be a bit more like ours.
Yeah. If we zoomed out, because we've been talking for quite a while, but if we zoom out to sort of supply chain sustainability in its broadest term, where do you feel business is in general? Are we stroppy teenagers, maturing adults, veterans? Where are they on the life cycle of a sustainable supply chain? Do you think business might be?
It varies a lot by sector and by geography. So I think there are some sectors that are really on the money. The European automotive sector as one, maybe not automotive sector in other parts of the world, but certainly in Europe. Retail, because it's had to, because there is consumer demand now, and there is significant risk in the retail sector, particularly associated with ethical standards in supply chains. So they're doing pretty well. Everybody's got more to do. The sector that I work in construction, some pockets of good practice, but once again, could do better. I think there is a kind of synergy between how well a sector understands its supply chain and is able to manage it, and if they're good at that, then they're able to implement sustainability requirements relatively easily. It's still not easy, but relatively easily. So if you look at a sector like automotive, BMW know the supply chain of every component down to the last washer and the price of it down to the last euro cent. So they already have that understanding of the value chain, and quite a lot of other manufacturing sectors do too. In construction, in many cases, there's very little understanding beyond tier one, so it's quite difficult to engage. I think we get it now as a world that actually, do you know what? Most organizations deliver most of what they do through their supply chains. So if we're going to deliver sustainability, we've got to do it through our supply chains. It's the only way. So I think that kind of awakening, if you like, is pretty much alive in most parts of the world, and in most sectors. And those sectors that are better at managing their supply chains are probably doing better at imposing sustainability standards and actually delivering them.
Yeah. You mentioned the automotive industry. Of course, it's having to go through a massive transformation because no matter what their future is, it almost certainly doesn't include the standard internal combustion engine.
Yeah.
So, we've been talking about standards and continual improvement and things, but I suppose the question is, how do businesses transform their supply chains
Mm.
from a very mature technology to one of the
Yeah.
emerging technologies?
That's fascinating, isn't it? Because, and I think the speed of change as well is quite shocking in many cases. Um, a couple of examples of things that we've actually done recently in supply chain school. One is looking at solar panels and the ethical aspects of procuring solar panels. It's an industry very much dominated by China. There's very strong evidence to suggest that Uyghur forced labor is very prevalent in this supply chain, and it's very difficult to get your solar panels from anywhere else. So what do you do? So there is then this dichotomy between a world that's saying we've got to decarbonize. How are we going to do that? Yeah, solar panels. Go get some solar panels, and then the poor sod in procurement gets the job of getting the solar panels. But actually, there are much more significant externalities to think about there, because this is a relatively new product. There aren't the standards. If chief exec says go get more timber, then great, I can get FSC timber or PEFC or whatever. I can't get certified sustainable solar panels. They don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to do my research. So again, one of the benefits of a collaboration in the school is we've done that research on behalf of all of the partners.
Yeah.
And produced a really nice resume of the industry and some guidelines for buyers to understand what they might do. Another example, a piece of work that we're doing at the moment that's not published yet, is on HVO, hydrotreated vegetable oil, for the audience as a diesel substitute. Once again, there's a rush to it now because people suddenly wake up to the idea of this is a magic bullet. I can decarbonize all my engines and generators and all that stuff. I just have to buy some of this stuff and everything will be okay. And once again, we're finding, there's HVO and there's HVO. There's HVO that's made from used vegetable oil from the catering sector, and there's HVO that comes from palm oil in South America, which is responsible for massive deforestation. And once again, there is no certification. It's like the Wild West out there.
Yeah.
So there are huge challenges in this transformation. Not least, of course, again, we think about just transition as we move from one technology to another. How do we deal with those people and communities that are left behind?
Yes. Yes.
So I don't have the answers, I'm afraid.
Well, palm oil is an interesting one
that are being
because
tackled.
yeah, palm oil is an interesting one for me because my youngest at 11 years old refuses to eat anything with palm oil in it
Oh, good.
to save the orangutan. I wish the rest of the family could say the same, but
Yeah.
it proves how difficult it is, palm oil free material.
Yeah.
And we had the panel to try and find a sustainable palm oil standard.
Yes.
No, as far as I can see anywhere, if you're looking at chocolate, you get sustainable cocoa, but you don't get sustainable palm oil badges. So that seems to be a supply chain that's not quite got there yet. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. I think it is, and this is where the whole kind of skill set and focus of the procurement community has to change, because taking on these challenges, it's I call it lazy buying. You got this certificate, okay, I tick the box to say you got the certificate, and that's it. Unfortunately, with the transitions that we're experiencing now to different types of products, technologies, services, it's not possible to do that. So, the procurement community really needs to do its due diligence well. But again, from my experience in the supply chain school, the best way to do that is to do it together. And that means working with organizations that maybe previously you considered to be your competitors. Actually, you've got these common problems, and the resource implications of doing the sort of in-depth work that we've recently done on solar panels, very difficult for one organization to justify the cost in resource of doing that, or engaging consultants, or however you do it. there's a very significant cost in doing it. But actually, that piece of work is probably applicable to 100 other organizations. So why not get together and do it once?
Yeah, fantastic. Well, we're almost out of time, but if I could ask one final question is,
Hmm.
if you were talking to somebody starting out in a sustainability career today, what would your advice be?
Don't do it. No, seriously. I think my advice would be start behaving like a business person. In the very early days when I was dealing with the environmental department, the S word hadn't been invented then. Um, they were acting like an internal NGO. That they were trying to make me feel guilty about all the terrible things that we're doing. So I think my advice would be ditch the guilt trip and start to think about setting sustainability in the context of whatever organization it is you're working with, and then you'll find that you're pushing an open door.
Brilliant. And on that note, which I think was a brilliant piece of advice, I'd like to thank you very much, Shaun, for joining us today and sharing the wisdom from a veritable multitude of experiences. Thank you, Shaun.
Okay, thanks very much, Gareth. It's been a pleasure.